Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Nebraska's Oregon Trail. This article was written by Francis M. Dishner. It says, despite the testimony of the early missionaries to the effect that Indians had no prehistoric trails, there is much to evidence the proof that long before the white men entered the land of wealth beyond the Missouri, there were well-being tracks across the plains. All of the early illustrious visitors to the West, General G.M. Dodge, John G. Fremont, Francis Parkman, the famous historian, Major Long, Rufus Sage, and Lewis and Clark indicated that Indian parties traveled along certain routes. Major Long further discovered that often the Indians would extend their single-file system to 3 parallel lines, so as to make the impression that their ponies were far too many to ride in one file. The Pawnees. Since the Pawnees were the only pure Nebraska tribe, it is of them that we chiefly speak. The early surveyors give the Pawnees a great tribute when they write that from the outset, a mere following of the Pawnee trails led to discovering the best surface land and the most logical fords at rivers. As a crown to this faith, it is a fact today that most of the railroad lines which span the states are built over the identical paths of these primitive tribesmen. The greatest of these aboriginal roads was the Oregon Trail, the most famous highway in the history of the world. Inasmuch as this renowned road was never planned, nor ever maintained in any way by governments or individuals, the Oregon Trail assumed a distinction every bit its own. In only one place on Earth can a duplication be even considered, and that is bleak Siberia. Even here, occasional towns dot the trails that traverse the vast waste. Not so on the early Oregon Trail. As late as 1843, with thousands of people from every corner of the world already passing over it, there were only 4 settlements between its start and finish. Its distance, 2,020 miles, made it the longest road in the world. Without Nebraska, the Oregon Trail would have been impossible. This is no idle boast, but can be clearly substantiated. While not much more than a fourth of its entire way extended through Nebraska, yet the history and traditions of the Oregon Trail is confined almost exclusively to Nebraska. Starting on practically the present site of Kansas City, the Oregon Trail entered Nebraska at the southeast corner of Jefferson County. Thence to the Platte River near Grand Island, west along this body of water to Fort Laramie, and then onward over the mountain ranges to Fort Vancouver in Washington. Gold Rush to California. The gold rush to California in 1839 brought hordes of immigrants along this line. Impatient in dropping down to Independence, Kansas, to get on the route, these eager people contrived a new line, following the famous Mormon Trail out of Florence, which ran straight west along the Platte River to Fort Laramie. The unique sights along the old Oregon Trail was a pleasant memory to all who ever traveled over it. Ash Hollow, 100 miles east of Fort Laramie, was the pretty ground around the headwaters of Ash Creek and presented a welcome haven to the plains wanderers. A curious uninhabited cabin stood at the hollow, in which immigrants left letters addressed to all parts of the world, trusting to the kindness of travelers going the other way to post them at the nearest post office. Bills and notices of all sorts were tacked on the walls, and with periodicals and printed matter of all sorts left by thoughtful visitors, this little cabin became a public reading room of the plains, perhaps the only one which ever existed. Courthouse Rock, west of Ash Hollow, is an immense hill on which nature seems to have deposited a business building. It was named by a band of St. Louisans because it appeared to them like a building from home. Chimney Rock, bolstered in the vast prairie like a gaunt sentinel, can be seen for 30 miles around. It is a lone rock, 120 feet high, resembling a smokestack, and is the cause of much wonderment. Scottsbluff comes next in line, a huge shaggy mound of rock and earth reaching into the sky. Naming in Scottsbluff. The story of how Scottsbluff received its name is another mute testimonial of the recklessness with which the early plainsmen carried themselves. An expedition of the American Fur Company, with a man named Scott at its head, was returning to St. Louis via the Platte River, when its leader fell sick. Deciding that Scott was only an impediment to them, and deciding that he would die, they deserted Scott, returned to civilization, and reported him dead. Left to his own terrible predicament, Scott crawled and staggered onward for 60 miles until he reached the bluff, which now bears his name. Here, totally exhausted by sickness and starvation, Scott wrapped himself in blankets to die. The following year, a party of trappers found the skeleton still enclosed in its protection from buzzards, and within the folds found papers identifying him and nailing the lie of his faithless companions. Other names for trail. Traversing Nebraska, the Oregon Trail was variously known as the Nebraska Trail, Oregon, Salt Lake, and Mormon. The original trail is known to have been traveled in part by Verendrye in 1742, used by Lewis and Clark in their famous Empire expedition, and employed by the Astor Fur parties as early as 1810 and 1812. As might be expected, famous writers have put their best talents to the perpetuation of the Oregon Trail. Perhaps the first man of note to produce a book of national interest was Washington Irving, who turned the public's attention by his adventures of Captain Bonneville. At a later date came his more pronounced Astoria, which took for its theme the thrilling escapades of the Astor Fur parties. The national love which is now so beautifully portrayed around the Oregon Trail was given its greatest impetus by the renowned historian Francis Parkman. In 1846, Parkman left St. Louis to travel purposely in the crude plains fashion along its route. At the journey's completion, he released What I Saw in California. Observing the giant future of the road, he conceived the idea of merging all available notes together with his own experiences and deductions into a comprehensive study, which he gave to the world as the Oregon Trail. The missionaries. Missionaries, too, created much excellent opinion in different parts of the country by relating the coming time and great possibilities of the land for which this road led. Father de Smet, the most famous missionary of the Oregon Trail, was a Belgian by birth, and thus grew up in a country of good roads. He declared that the Oregon Trail excelled the prevailing standard of European roads and its perfect adaptability to hard usage. The nature of the yielding surface, he observed, fitted the exacting traffic which passed over it, and surpassed the finest asphalt, brick, or stone in the ease on animals' hooves. Where an equal time would break a horse on a stone road, a day's travel along this packed dirt trail would scarcely ever cause lameness. Despite the perfectness of the dirt road along its banks, foolhardy men continued for a long time to prove the navigability of the Platte. These experiments never resulted in success, and numberless boats went to the bottom, or more frequently, became stuck in the sandbars to be rifled by prying Pawnee hands, while their owners attempted to get their cargo of furs into deep water again. Early hardships. But in the train of its glories, the Oregon Trail brought sorrows too. The vast number of immigrants that left St. Louis in quest of the Golden West were, for the most part, people unused to hardy pioneer life. A great majority came out of the eastern cities, accustomed to easier living, or worse still, from foreign nations where an entirely different climate and mode of living prevailed. People had no idea the countless weeks they must remain on the plains before they could hope for aid from other than their own supplies, and the success which the Almighty alone could put into the crack of their rifles. The supply of salt pork and flour disappeared rapidly, and then followed coffee, tea, and spices. This last luxury was the last link to civilization, for not even wild game of any sort was palatable without the application of salt at least. After the first few years, the abundance of wild game was gone, for men hunted too eagerly for food, and the grazing lands to either side of the trail were too green to risk annihilation of a herd along it. The subsequent result was the general plague of cholera along the trail. Stricken by the prairie germs that were rife at that time, undernourished immigrants fell easy prey to the hand of death. In later years, a tradition of terror arose from the graves of the Oregon Trail, mute evidences of brave souls that had ventured their best and lost. For some hundreds of miles out of Independence, a continual line of graves marked the progress of the trail, and by them were lost thousands of ambitions, for men of weaker blood could not stomach the stark prospects of such an ending. Early travel. A sketch of the Oregon Trail would not be complete without a mention of the famed methods of transportation used over it, as well as the pioneers who first proved it could be traveled. As far as can be verified, a man named Sublette drove the first wagon over the Oregon Trail in 1830, while Captain Nathaniel J. White made its first complete overland journey starting from Boston in April 1832 and reaching Vancouver in October of the same year. The success of White created a very good impression, and many thousands of eager people took heart. Saving the tradition of England's post-chaises, built up for centuries, can stagecoaches be designated as being so very famous as the fine vehicle which ran to either distant terminal of the Oregon Trail? In 1850, Samuel H. Woodston of Independence, Kansas, was given the first contract to operate a stagecoach line across the prairie. He named it the Overland Mail and made monthly trips between Independence and California. The name of Ben Holloway comes forward as the greatest one in the Oregon Trail expresses. Early sensing the fortune to be harvested in this enterprise, Holloway installed a series of Concord coaches, built by the world-famed Abbott Downing Company of Concord, Massachusetts, and made first weekly, then daily trips to the West Coast. Once arranged on regular schedule, these prairie coaches became the marvel of transportation. They averaged 115 miles a day, traveled in all weathers, and by the labor of 9 mules or horses, could pull 9 passengers and much baggage. Later, mail and valuables were added, and these overland coaches became a very important link between the two ends of civilization in the United States. Thousands of dollars and all sorts of valuables were transported, and as nothing else could, the multitude of people who used them carried the finest of advertising of the land flowing with milk and honey, for which the road and its coaches ran. The Pony Express. The Pony Express likewise became a romantic institution. It was started by Alexander Majors, whose idea was to carry mail to and from California by a series of swift ponies, starting periodically at either end and change of both riders and mounts at regular intervals. In spite of the efficiency and quick support of the Pony Express, the scheme was never a paying proposition. The contract given by the Post Office Department to Majors called for service until the completion of the telegraph lines. In the matter of 2 years of operation, the Express lost $200,000, and it was to the financial satisfaction of all concerned when it was revoked. The system, though, is highly indicative of the adventurous spirit of the early plainsmen. The Oregon Trail is now but a memory. As early as 1873, J. Sterling Morton, who has done a vast good in the preservation of its glories, made a trip of investigation and found that in especially the west portion of the state stood a touching remembrance of the old trail. For miles in the valleys, he perceived a continual line of huge sunflowers, growing only in its path, standing sentinel over the ground consecrated by the sweat and blood of every nation. A noteworthy movement of the Daughters of the American Revolution is rapidly nearing completion. At strategic points where the traveler may best see, they have caused to be erected fitting monuments. In generations to come, the Oregon Trail will take, as it has commenced already, its proper place amongst Valley Forge and Gettysburg as the glorious ruin of a nation in the making. This story came from the great state of Nebraska, being reported in the Shelby Sun of July 14, 1927. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.